Hey folks, welcome to Unsung Podcast. My name is Mark. I'm joined again by Chris.
By Chris. I mean, if it was someone else, people would fall off their seat.
They would be wondering, who's that guy?
Well, hang on, there is someone else.
There is someone else. Hi, Ferro.
Hi, how you doing? Hi. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you again. Are you ready to talk about No Wave?
Always ready to talk about
Born
No Wave.
ready. This guy was born ready to talk about No Wave.
Everyday small talk for me.
So in the last episode, we're not going to waste any time. So we're obviously recording this in one big chunk, and we're in our flow. So last episode we talked about. Well, we're working up to US Maple here, folks. But we talked about the early 20th century experimental music, the gramophone. Really, we touched on that, how that technology changed composers' predictions of what music would be like in the future, and then we brought that into the kind of the 60s especially. Rock and roll was still quite young, but people like Captain Beefheart started subverting it pretty much straight away. That took us into the 70s. We had Lou Reed, Velvet Underground. We had Per Ubu, we finished on last week. We also have people like Alan Vega and Suicide, who I think are huge in terms of dismantling expectations and rebuilding them. Took their time to do it as well, as we spoke about. It took like 7 or 8 years to get that album together. And a number of other key figures. Captain Beefheart, we just can't overstate how huge they are in this story. But this week we're going to talk about a very localised phenomenon that happened in the very late 70s in terms of no-wave music, and a fella called Brian Eno, who took a wee trip over for just a standard recording job in New York with the Talking Heads, as you do. I'm sure we've all done it. And then happened upon this event that was taking place in an art space, and changed his life, but also changed, I think, to some extent, the course of modern music. So let's get into that subject. Cracking on with this, because we've mentioned it a few times, the no-wave explosion in New York City, and Ferro touched on it. A city in decay in the 1970s. Now, this is a whole sociological, historical thing that you can go into, but we'll summarise it here, okay?
It's also where hip-hop came from as well.
It is, yeah. So there's a movie called Downtown 81 that features a number of the no-wave bands that we'll talk about. James Chance, the Contortions, DNA, Mars, Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. It also, that documentary centres around an artist, Jean-Michel Basquiat.
I've seen his name a lot of places.
Yeah, so he's a neo-expressionist painter. I've actually seen his work. It's really impressive stuff. But he had a band called Grey. Which I think in itself is fascinating, because he also partly embodies the kind of clumsy way that art and music definitions and barriers all started to blur. You didn't necessarily have to be the most talented musician to be able to partake in that enterprise under the no-wave banner. Now, I'm going to refer actually here to an excellent and bizarrely deleted anonymous Reddit post that came up, where somebody wrote a really extensive piece on this. But no wave refers to a short-lived punk offshoot, arguably a type of post-punk that emerged out of New York City in the late 1970s, with close connections to the obviously hugely influential avant-garde music and art scenes in that city at the same time. Musically, it's less about a consistent sound than a philosophy centred around rejecting what was seen as punk's fetishization of traditional rock. So rather than stripping down rock and roll to its roots, as a lot of punks sought to do, the idea was to go even further than punk and avoid traditional rock structures, embrace dissonance, noise, and generally make a bunch of music that often sounded like people who'd just picked up their instruments today and were trying to figure out what to do. It's not really so distant from what a lot of other post-punk was doing or would do, with maybe a bit more of its roots in avant jazz in some of the cases, but they were also very early to the party in the no wave scene, either predating or concurrent with a lot of the classic post-punk albums that we would maybe think of these days. So it deserves credit for that. But New York City in the 1970s was very integral to that. The New York City that no wave spawned from was a relentlessly gritty, dismal, dangerous city. To the extent where, Times Square was a really precarious place to spend time, especially after dark. And getting a taxi to, I don't know, let's say any number of popular Brooklyn neighbourhoods like Williamsburg or Bushwick now, at the time, you'd be taking your life in your hands. There's a Swans documentary, we'll talk about Swans in a moment, Where Does a Body End? Michael Gira talks about how his Soho studio apartment where the band would practice was constantly surrounded by junkies. And Soho, of all places, it's very upmarket now. It's one of the poshest places in Manhattan to live today. So the sound had an element of the artists and the grim spectacle in New York City that outside of that Wall Street facade of what we think about was decaying and genuinely on the verge of total collapse, economic collapse. There's another post on Reddit by somebody called Goma N1717, and it's worth quoting. The No New York compilation that came out in 1978, only 3 years after New York City had famously been declared bankrupt as a city and in many ways just shut down. A lot of the basic services of that city didn't happen. Trash, maintenance, all that kind of thing. It was an absolute dive, and that actually continued right into the 90s. At the same time, no wave as an art form was really quite pretentious. The scene itself was made up of a lot of art school kids who'd moved to New York because it was cheap and it was bohemian. For example, Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, who we'll talk about, out of everyone in that band, only the drummer was from New York. Compared with the later hardcore scene that we've talked about, the no wave scene was made up of what they call blow-ins, people that left art schooly scenes elsewhere and just arrived in New York for this bohemian lifestyle. So yeah, no wave had a huge and lasting influence on punk and even post 2000s pop. I use the example of the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, who started as much of a no wave band as they were a new wave band, really. And all the if you look at the Load Records stuff that came out, we've talked about Black Dice, but they came out of the Providence scene, Pink and Brown, Lightning Bolt, Six Finger Satellite. They're really influenced by this deconstructionist sort of anarchic quality of no wave. But no wave was very much a product of art school bohemian types meets a city on its financial knees. But yeah, just winding back very slightly there. So I dropped a pretty big bomb in there about the No New York compilation. That was like a huge moment. And I think you were saying this before we hit record, Mark, that this is such a huge moment that we might not even be talking about no wave at all if it wasn't for the fact that this happened. So in 1978, a compilation album called No New York comes out. It was actually compiled by Brian Eno.
Which is wild in and of itself.
Yeah, so Brian Eno was over, he was much sought after at the time. He's over in New York recording Talking Heads, of all people. He went to an event one night where there were 10 bands playing this mini festival in an art space. It included the band The Contortions, who I mentioned, and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, featuring Lydia Lunch.
She was so good, by the way. Oh, she is so good. Back then, she was great.
She's clearly unsung in the minds of the public in terms of her significance. But he spotted a scene emerging and he was like, well, I need to document this. He actually ultimately ended up recording 4 of the acts. In some cases, the recordings were just straight, live performances with minimal miking, no overdubs. And some others that were a bit more complex. Ferro, I believe you've actually got a copy of this compilation. The original pressing had the lyrics inside the sleeve, so that if you wanted to read the lyrics, you had to rip the sleeve apart.
Yeah.
You have the original one, or do you have a repress?
No, I have a repress.
Repress, so you can read the lyrics without tearing it to bits.
Okay.
So when it came out, though, it actually took some pelters from the critics. Since then, it's clearly, in retrospect, become iconic. But no, it took a wee bit of stick at the time. Just to bring you up to speed, it features 4 bands, as I say, from New York City. Teenagers and the Jerks, Lydia Lunch had her own solo career, as well as loads of impressive collaborations. The Contortions, which included a guy called James Chance. We'll talk about him shortly. A band called Mars, who for me are the most extreme listen on there. And a band called DNA, who are really angular and often quite purposefully ugly, with bits of keyboard, and were a precursor to a couple of things that we'll talk about in side B of the show.
So it's interesting, right? So when I was doing my research and cramming like fuck before this episode started,
it's a lot of info
for many reasons that I'm not going to go into. It wasn't until literally about an hour for this episode where I started to realise that actually Brian Eno is oddly really pivotal.
Hugely pivotal.
Which is not the Brian Eno that I would ever associate. You know, when you were talking there about the bands just being recorded as is, I mean, that's not, you know, it's studio as an instrument, you know.
He didn't do it with all of them, but yeah.
That's the received knowledge, the received wisdom of Brian Eno. It's like he's a master producer, big music nerd, clearly huge music nerd as that
huge.
But
I think what's most interesting about it, more than just the music itself, is that it put the entire movement on the map. And you do have to wonder as well how many movements have been in cities around the globe that haven't had a Brian Eno walk into one of their concerts and be like blown away by what's happening and capture it, and therefore kind of trap it in amber for the world to be able to appreciate generation after generation the way we can with No Wave, which is a very short-lived thing, really, overall. Ferro, in terms of the record, you're the guy that's lived with it the longest. What do you make of it musically?
I mean, first of all, this record was criticized by some of the bands in typical snobbish new wave fashion. New York fashion, sorry. In typical snobbish New York fashion, it was kind of criticized by some of the bands who took part, even though it gave them visibility that they previously obviously didn't have, because they said, "Oh, it's just a way of, it's just another way for Brian Eno to kind of showcase his cutting edge taste, you know, and kind of patronize another musical movement." The way he did a bit with krautrock, you know, if you think about it, without Brian Eno being such a champion for people like Connie Plank and all the bands connected to krautrock, you know, probably we wouldn't be as familiar with it as we are now, you know? Yeah. So it was always him and David Bowie, in the case of krautrock, were big champions of what's going on. Anyway, so when the compilation came out, some people said, "Oh, he arrived late." You know, but by that point, you know, many of these bands were almost breaking up or already broken up. You know, which was true in a way, because some of the bands were such volatile creatures. Some of these bands that, especially think about Teenagers and the Jerks. You know, I think by the time the compilation came out, Lydia Lunch was on to other things already. So, musically speaking, I think it's absolutely brilliant, because in a way it takes New York music even further than it already went with the first wave of new wave bands that came out of New York just a few years before, you know. think about Television, the Ramones, Blondie, and all those bands, that just came out, Talking Heads, so on and so forth, which were already pretty cutting edge bands for the times. So it certainly showcased the vitality of the New York scene, which seemed basically an endless source of musical creativity back then. You rightly mentioned hip hop before, At the same time, hip hop was starting to move its first steps, So this minimalistic approach, which was shared by the no wave scene, with hip hop, for instance, was pretty evident. The idea that the viscerality and wild, deranged approach could coexist with experimental attitude was really important. It was a typical New York thing. It came from the Velvet Underground. It came from the Ramones, the Dead Boys, all the bands that had been playing in New York, which were kind of combining these two elements, this artistic range, this artistic and aesthetic and taste for the complex aesthetic, but at the same time, a very streetwise, a very wild, a very feral approach to the instruments and to music. This is the best combination that New York has ever expressed, this combination between basically street violence and art and high conceptual art. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think there's an element of contrarianism in there as well, because as you said, some of the bands in New Wave were already quite cutting edge.
Yeah.
And then this movement came along and superseded that by being like, no, these guys are too commercial. Let's be even less commercial and more challenging. And No Wave came along with a slight snobbishness.
Totally.
As I mentioned earlier on as well, the poverty in the state of New York at the time was a big driving factor, but so was that influx of artists and bohemian kind of post-hippie type kids who were determined that they were going to go to this place on cheap rent and take drugs and just generally like get lost in this world of creativity. And so there's a lot of art sensibilities that will draw a parallel very shortly with places like Berlin, who were also cities that were in bad financial straits, but
absolutely
had a massive artistic community and there's a lot of criticism levelled at No Wave and at this compilation and at the bands around it. I mentioned Teenage Jesus and the Jerks having only one New Yorker in the band, and people saw it as being very almost gentrified, very kind of patronising in its own way. It's like all these like cool hippie kids have blown in, and then they'll go back home and they'll make money off their parents once they're done, but New York will still be in the gutter. And I think there's a really interesting quality to that. I do also want to say, this is a whole hole that we could tumble down, but it is fascinating to me, being in Glasgow. I've seen multiple movements come and go within Glasgow, and very few of them have ever gotten traction outside the city, especially a couple in particular that I think were particularly strong. They didn't have a Brian Eno, a figure with clout who was there and also had the imagination, to give credit to Brian Eno, to be like, this needs recorded. And I'm sure that almost every major city in Europe, across the world, has seen a glut of bands come along that influence each other, that draw from similar sources, that have a reciprocal kind of impact upon the sound. There's a moment, there's a bubble of cohesion and something happening, but there is no Brian Eno there to capture it. So as much as these bands were pissing and moaning, the only reason that we're probably talking about them is because this guy cared enough to actually do something about it. And goodness knows, there's so many bands from our collective youths and everybody listening's collective youths that they're like, wow, yeah, that could have totally happened in my city. We had about 4 or 5 bands that were brilliant. I think that's a really fascinating insight into how fickle that can be. Because I think this is a really interesting record. I enjoyed it, but I don't think it's any better than one I could put together of 4 Glasgow bands from 2003. I think you could do the same thing in probably every major city at a certain time. So I don't mean to play it down, but it does strike me that music and art is that fickle. It's that wafer thin, whether or not you manage to enter the history books or not,
Yeah. Yeah.
You certainly need somebody. I mean, obviously, the criticism against Brian Eno was an act of snobbery, but
Yeah.
and obviously, he was beneficial to that scene. Absolutely. I have to say that musically speaking, I mean, we still can hear the influence of no wave in the whole skin graft scene, and we can see it in the whole new noise scene that came out. You mentioned bands like post-noise band that came out in the early 2000s, somehow are indebted, or most of them are indebted to that approach. So, I mean, I think it would have been a scene that somehow would have influenced or would have emerged somehow. Obviously, not in the same way as it has, thanks to Brian Eno. I think that it has some inherent qualities, that makes it stand out.
Yeah, I mean, there would have been an element of attention on it. I mean, Lydia Lunch of Teenage Jesus and the Jerks was dating and collaborated with Nick Cave at that point, which, I mean, obviously Nick Cave, when it was in The Birthday Party, we spoke about them last week, arguably being one of the origins of goth rock, but also just the noise rock. The Birthday Party were massively influential in that. So yeah, there's enough of a musical footprint there that it maybe would have got some traction. James Chance, though, is a good example of someone that perhaps didn't out with that scene. So James Chance was part of the Contortions, but a saxophonist who he only died last year. I think it was June last year. Key figure in the no wave scene. Part of that compilation. Contortions have a funky disco hint to them. There's an album called Bye from 1979 that shows they've got a lot of musical ability, which I think distinguishes them from some of their peers at the time. I think James Chance had commented he tried to go to study jazz saxophone, and then he found that he just always preferred rock music, and therefore his style kept getting caught in between jazz and rock, and that created this weird kind of place that he ended up in musically. Pardon the pun. By chance, he met Lydia Lunch at CBGB's and fell into this emerging scene. I also think it's really interesting that both the new wave and the no wave scenes and the hardcore scenes were like CBGB's was just so integral to all of these things coalescing around somewhere. But yeah, James Chance as well, famously quite physical and confrontational at shows. He had this thing about slapping audience members. I think at one point he was done for assaulting a critic at a show as well.
Yeah, so the critic he assaulted was Robert Christgau. Yeah. He's one of the most important music journalists that's ever lived. Maybe not so much in the last 20 years because the guy is old as balls now, but I think he's in his 80s. But he was around for all that stuff, and he's Boston Jazz.
The column on
the column.
Village Voice.
The Village Voice.
Which paper in New York?
Yeah, the Village Voice.
Yeah, the famous column, which was like the reference for basically the music scene in New York for a long time.
James Chance
battled him. Is in a way.
He slapped him. Yeah, he slapped him. Which is wild because he is like, even he still reviews music to this day, and he's in his 80s.
He didn't like
stuff,
it. I mean, a lot of people apparently got slapped, but he didn't like it.
Nevertheless, so the Village Voice still put no wave records in their albums of the year that year.
Yeah, I mean it was hot as well. But
they listened to it. Like he listened to everything. Like that's one of the things that makes him such a good critic. Is he had one of the deepest tastes in the world. Like he listened to everything. And I judged it all.
So what we don't want to do though is fall into the trap of casting or drawing the parameters here too narrow, because as Ferro says, yes, the influence went much later, but also even just immediately off the back of that into the 80s, you had some very, very important and influential acts just in New York as well as out with. So just in New York, you had Sonic Youth appearing. Confusion is Sex debut album is very much a no wave record. Lydia Lunch took part in that. She was in Death Valley 69. We've got, was it a double episode on Sonic Youth that we did? Goodness knows. There's plenty of content there if you want to go and talk.
Not my favourite episode, but I won't lie.
Doing an episode in Sonic Youth and going through their back catalogue is a tough task. They have some very experimental phases.
Still a good episode, I just didn't enjoy it personally.
Yeah, but they also have some very, very musical phases, as the album we chose for that, Rather Ripped. I think it's a very musical album. Like many of these bands, they go between, even US Maple have that. Swans, Michael Guerra's band, their first 2 records, so you got Filth in 83 and you got Cop in 84. Hugely influential, incredibly nihilistic music and lyrics. Massive role in Ferro. I'm sure you'll agree here. Both the evolution of industrial and of doom and of noise rock. Swans actually started in 81. They are one of those bands that we spoke about, the Red Crayola. They survived the short-lived no-wave scene. They went on for decades. The sound changed, much heavier and darker than a lot of their peers from the off. I think more about ferocity and impact than melody for much of the early years, until Jarbo joined in about 86, when they started really giving a shit about trying to be musical at all. It's easy to forget that they came from that.
They came. So basically, they came right after the no wave scene, but they were always their own creature. They didn't belong to any particular scene. And also because Michael Gira was a kind of an isolationist. It's always been a kind of
absolutely
kind of a particular figure from the get go. He used to put his own bandmates through actual physical pain, like wanting them to perform barefoot, in places like CBGs, which were disgustingly dirty.
The toilet leaking over the stage was very famous.
So we're all about pushing everything to extremes. And the first records are a physical endeavor, They're so fucking intense, and they also influence, like if you think about certain bands of like post metal now, the influence of Swans is so massive, in the way, it's enormous, So noise, yes, industrial, folk rock, like a certain idea of this majestic approach to folk rock, these huge atmospheres, these acoustic songs that sound like an orchestra, basically. If you take this, I'm talking about the second part of Swan's career. They kind of brought that into the scene with a very strong personality. They're an incredible band. They're incredibly intense. Like, they're not a band that you can just you know what, I'm gonna put on Soundtrack for the Blind tonight. Just
it's not a fun listen.
You have to be physically and mentally prepared to face them anytime, both on record and especially in a live context. But then one of those bands that if they weren't there, music would be completely different. Like they're kind of a monolith. They're kind of something that you have to, a force to be reckoned with. It's something that you just can't ignore.
I think there are people in that category that are out with New York as well. But even just within New York, another band, or maybe two less kind of spoken about bands. There's Rat R. Rat R. They had an album called A Merside Rock and Roll Is Dead Long. They formed in 81. They moved from Philadelphia to New York City to be part of that scene. One of the members of the band was Glenn Branca's cousin, so they quickly fell in with the no wave scene. But that album in particular is a really, really interesting. I think it's played live. Really, really interesting document of that. You also had a band called Bush Tetras, formed in 1979. debatably early disco punk, but it utilised so much discomfort in the tones and also in the arrangements that I think it qualifies as deconstructing rock music a lot. You can really hear their influence big time on that resurgent disco rock of the early 2000s. So, like, the first Liars album, They Threw Us All in a Pit, is basically a noised up version of them. Wake up, young pussy on fire. Not too political, nothing too clever. And I think bands like The Rapture really used their template as well, yeah. But I mean, as Ferro's talking about Swans and their massive influence, elsewhere there were bands that very quickly clicked onto this within a couple of years, and they had different things going on, but they were also, I think, congruent with this. So, Mark, we spoke about it, Foetus, or Scraping Foetus Off the Wheel, or Foetus Under Glass, J.G. Thirlwell's project,
or Foetus
Interruptus, or any number of other iterations, not from New York City. He was Australian and it was via London, but he did tour and he did collaborate with Lydia Lunch and others in the scene. The 1984 album Hole, I think, it's a real biggie. Massive industrial pioneer, big influence on Trent Reznor. Vocal samples were a really big thing that he brought to the party. I think you quite liked that, didn't you?
I really enjoyed Hole.
But I didn't expect that at all.
So I have a friend who is really into J.G. Thirlwell, generally.
Bearing in mind that this could be another episode again. So
yeah, I'm not going to go deep into it, but it just gets it's overblown. It's really overblown. You know, I think some of the no wave stuff and anti-rock stuff that I've kind of listened to, is, even though it's caustic and nihilistic, it also feels oddly understated to me.
Okay.
You know, as if
underproduced a lot.
Yeah, as if they're not really, as if they're enjoying what they're doing clearly, but they're also not maximising it. Clearly, J.G. Thirlwell is pushing in every direction, and production-wise, the vocals are immaculately produced in that record. You know that. Every single instrument sounds like in its right place.
Well, I think a bit like a name drop Nine Inch Nails there, but I think a bit like the early Nine Inch Nails stuff, he also starts to fold in a bit of the kind of hip hop thing of New York as well. You start to hear that emerging sampled beat sort of thing happening. I don't think it's so far removed from kind of anti-rock in terms of deconstructing things, but with a high level of skill that it doesn't qualify.
I think probably the reason I enjoyed that record so much is because it's very musical, obviously musical. And there's a lot of industrial on it as well.
There is.
And quite. It's actually really, really interesting because you can hear that maybe the needle hasn't moved that much since 1984.
True. But you're touching on a couple of things there, Ferro. Maybe throw this over to you. I think the likes of Throbbing, Gristle and things like that qualify as well.
I did listen to
totally subverting in an industrial vein.
20 jazz,
absolutely.
20 jazz greats.
20 jazz greats.
Yeah.
The first thing I thought when I heard it was Nine Inch Nails.
I don't think there's an industrial or extreme band, even an electronic band, that aren't influenced by Throbbing Gristle.
Yeah.
They're massive in this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the industrial term was first used by Monte Casazza. I think it was widely used for the first time to describe Throbbing Gristle. The influence that they have now on ranges from noise rock to electronic body music, you know. Then they also had a spin-off project called Psyche TV, which was distinctively electronic. Their whole imagery was extremely bleak and extremely depressing, if you want, but at the same time, it had a kind of a psychedelic, weird psychedelic side to it. A wildly experimental band. They weren't particularly young in terms of experience because some of them came from the experience of Hypnosis. If you may know Hypnosis, the collective that designed covers for many rock bands, huge rock bands like Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd. So they were hippies who turned into post-punk industrialists,
like nihilists. I think there's an element of just like
there's a lot of
playful.
There's a common trait. There's a common trait. Think about the Residents. Think about Red Crayola.
Yeah.
There's a trait of experimentation that comes from the late 60s, early 70s, and connects this scene, this anti-rock scene with the experience of the 60s, early 70s. Anyway, Throbbing, Gristle, yeah.
I mean, there's more in that category as well. I would imagine, like Nurse with Wound and bands like that, or projects like that started to just enjoyed the chaos of going down this road. To be fair, and we've touched on this, part of that subversion crossed into rhetoric. It crossed into saying the most provocative things, and there was a lot of space to hide behind. We've talked about Boyd Rice, we've talked about, Douglas P. and things like that, how provocation became the order, and it was like, and anything goes. And you had some people that were saying things just to be provocative, versus some people that were actually saying things because they actually thought it. But
absolutely. There's a big difference between somebody like Boyd Rice, who's essentially, I don't know. I have no respect for, and people like Throbbing, Gristle, or even North Wound. Of course, these people dabbled with negative imagery, but the level of it wasn't just for provocation's sake. There was always a strong artistic, let's say, motivation behind it, or whether some other guys just did it for.
But it was a big tent, and that's
carve a little niche for themselves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Another one that we have to mention before we just wind up for this side is Einstürzende Neubauten. So we spoke about the urban decay of New York having a massive influence, as well as the artistic nature of New York, the influx of all these bohemian types. They have so many parallels with the no wave movement coming from Berlin. A famously vibrant and edgy art scene in Berlin, even post-war. But clearly, the war destroyed the city. The Quietus has got an interesting bit. Over their 3.5 decades of operation, this has included jackhammers, sheet metal and fire, and instrumentation perfectly suited to the broken terrain of a city smashed into submission and never properly rebuilt. That was the story of Einstürzende Neubauten from the 70s when they were emerging. I think maybe slightly unfairly, they're often depicted as a band that started loud and mellowed out, which I think is a wee bit inaccurate. Ferro will probably agree with that, but they have some stuff from right back at, like 1980, like Schwarze, that illustrates some really uncomfortable early minimalism. And I think that sense of minimalism, but dissonance within it, is really integral. By 1982, they were collaborating with Lydia Lunch as well. We're back with Lydia. She's just such a linchpin in the story of No Wave. And I think the stuff they were doing is both industrial and like gently dissonant. Like they're very tactful in the way they go about it at times, and just sounds way ahead of its time. There's one track in particular. I don't know how it. Zerstorte Zelle. It has this really lumbering tempo and it's very sparse, uneasy guitar that I think, for example, we'll probably refer to when we're talking about US Maple, about the Talker era. But I don't think even US Maple ever get as close to being as grim as Einstürzende. But they are a band that were coming out of like a really like a societal crisis to some extent in Berlin at that point. You've got to remember as well, Berlin was partitioned. You had the Cold War going on. There were so many factors that played into this band's mythos. Again, probably another double episode just on them alone. But I think they tie in to creating, to carving out this area where they were deconstructing and nihilistically ripping apart tropes of rock music and art and putting them back together again in ways that were quite uncomfortable, but that took an incredible amount of talent to do.
Yeah, I think that it raised a kind of a comparison or a bridge between New York and Berlin, which is, I think, incredibly accurate. Berlin was the other place in Europe, namely in this case, where you could go and experiment and grow, far away from, in this case, even farther away from the music industry, compared to New York. It was a perfect place for bands to reinvent themselves. It's been used a huge number of times, from Bowie and Iggy Pop to even U2. They used it for the same purpose, because in a way, it's a space where, still, again, you can fail, you can experiment, you can spend there a few months. You don't have to please nobody. People were used to the presence of artists and bohemians and
free to fail. That's what you said earlier on. You were free to fail in Berlin.
Yeah, exactly. You could experiment. You could be as extreme as you wanted, even if you were an established artist, and nobody would have cried, scandal for it. It was perfectly normal to be weird, and. So many artists were trying to recapture probably part of their soul, or thought that they needed some creative space away from pressure. Found in Berlin the perfect environment. And Einstürzende and Neubauten were a product of Berlin. They were native product, local, indigenous product of the city, and they embodied this attitude. The first time they went to Hansa studio, they showed with their industrial. Equipment. By industrial, I mean really industrial, like building tools that they had, and they started destroying the floor of the studio and miking their own sledgehammers and stuff, And after a couple of seconds, the guys from the studio said, "Okay, no, guys, this is not the way we're supposed to record this album, and let's do it outside." So I think they recorded part of the album outside of the studio, where they could basically dig holes and as much as they wanted.
There's a big parallel there with the music concrete.
Hey, exactly.
Music like concrete, literally, but like actually going right back to that 1920s and 30s sort of like liberation from like conventional instrumentation. They sort of channel that 50 years later, which is a really fascinating parallel. These future echoes of the past continue. I mean, Ferro, you talked about earlier on. So the no wave influence clearly spread. There are hundreds of bands across hundreds of continents. We could talk about this forever. Chicago was no exception. That's going to be a key feature of the next part of this. We'll look at the way in which the legacy of no wave manifested there. But elsewhere, I mean, one band that I think we should give a nod to before we finish here is Polvo from North Carolina. So it's a band that definitely deserves a bit of attention for bridging into other genres. I would suggest that they bridged it into post-hardcore. They've got an album from 1992, Core Crane Secret, full of totally dissonant, innovative stuff, but it reconciles more often into musicality, whilst also being a bit of a precursor to what US Maple would do. There's a track on it, for example, the second one, Calgon, spelled with a K. Absolutely part of the lineage of this conversation. And there's another one on it, Ox Scapula. Such a strong song that actually influenced a band of the same name over here. But it's post-hardcore yet channeling that early Sonic Youth stuff, including the obstinate way that it just decides to stop when it feels like it, totally subverting those expectations of the audience. Like, oh, they've got a bit going. They just destroyed it for no reason, suddenly. The New York experimental scene, late 90s, early 2000s, you've got Friction Brothers, not Fiction Brothers, featured the guy called Fred Lundberg-Holm. guy refers to himself as the anti-cellist. He was a very celebrated, classically trained musician. Worked with all manner of people, though, out with what you would consider classical circles, you know. But Fred Lombard-Combe played with classical tropes, used items, non-musical tools again, using screwdrivers and all kinds of stuff in the context of playing cello. Very much walks the line between composition and performance art, and I think, again, goes back to the musique concrète a bit. We mentioned Liars earlier on. Liars, yes, their first album came in on the back of that kind of like ramped up disco punk thing, but they went on to really embrace the reincarnation of the no wave mantle. They had an album, They Were Wrong So We Drowned, I think is the name of their second record. It's a really difficult but very self-aware slice of deference and nods to that no-wave era. I think they knew they were sort of inheriting a bit of that. It was their job to carry that forward. And another band from New York around about the same time, Oneida. Now, Oneida did a lot of different sounds, but their earlier work used a lot of multi-drums, synths, noise loops, things like that going on. Their debut album, which I think was about 1997, came out. It's really skittish, really obtuse. I think there's a tune in it, I think it was called Go There, which had a very mumbled vocal part in it, which I think is quite, let's say, it's got a lot in common with what we'll talk about in the case of US Maple. And in 2000, they brought out an album which I think kind of nicely sums this up. The album's sort of sarcastically called Come On Everybody, Let's Rock. And there's a track in it called I Love Rock. Very sardonic, and is maybe what I think US Maple would have sounded like had they, spoiler alert, ever embraced real distortion, which they never did. So yeah, there is like a consistent rebubbling of this sentiment of rejection and subversion that goes on in New York, specifically with the no-wave thing, but much more widely with the kind of anti-rock sentiment of Einstürzende, Neubauten and Throbbing, Gristle and all these different iterations. And just as we finish up here, I think we also, I'm sure there's loads of ideas that pop into people's heads, but it is worth saying that there are a lot of bands that push their own limits, you know, basically non-anti-rock bands that didn't have that mindset, but who did start to dabble in these things. So they veer so far off their original sound that they end up in anti-rock territory. Sometimes it even manifests as like a full rejection of their earlier work, almost like a sort of self-sabotaging sentiment. They deliberately challenge their audience. They take the releases and sometimes take their audience to breaking point where they start to subvert it. I mean, we've discussed Melvins. We've discussed the Butthole Surfers, you know, Locust Abortion Technician. I think, Ferro, you're a big Wire fan, but I think Wire did a lot of this.
Yeah.
Let's see how far we can piss off our audience and see how far they'll go with us.
Yeah. One of their mottos was "Don't rock out."
Don't rock out. Exactly. So, and I actually genuinely think, and this is a bit like my Lana Del Rey hot take on the goth rock episode, Mark, but I think some would even say that Radiohead did that.
Some folk agreed with you, by the way, in TikTok about Lana Del Rey being goth.
I take it back.
People who liked Lana Del Rey. So
every negative I've ever said about TikTok. But I think Radiohead did this as well. I think Radiohead got really I mean, you can hear it on Paranoid Android that they were rejecting the stuff from the Bends. But then even more so with Kid A and Amnesiac and stuff, they almost decided, let's completely dismantle all of this. Let's just strip this apart, turn it into something else, see if these motherfuckers will still buy our record. I think there's a real hostility and the willingness to challenge it, because some of those records are really quite non-musical, well, not non-musical, but they're unpleasant.
The King of the Limbs and stuff like that.
Well, they continue that, yeah. And like Ferro was saying about Christmas, we talked about the parallels between Radiohead and Christmas, actually, musically as well, later on. They're caught in this spiral of self-awareness and sort of sickness with their own past back catalogue, and they start to like tear it to bits and tear their own reputation to bits. Except for Radiohead, I think it actually just kept paying off.
And the road goes.
It's a band that actually benefited from this act of almost wanton self-destruction that they were engaged in. People just went with them on it because it was very musical. So I think No Wave and lots of these influences are probably part of what got all these kind of bands to those conclusions. From Butthole Surfers to Radiohead to Throbbing Gristle, there's music concrete. It all fits in that really complex tapestry of people who just get disillusioned, and they're maybe, I don't say they're non-musical, they're coming from more of an art perspective, a sense of wanting to challenge and wanting to disrupt. Some of them crossed over into music without maybe the requisite skills. Others, like we talked about with Captain Beefheart, there was so much musical ability in there that then went to this nefarious end of like trying to like subvert their audience. And I just think that's like really fascinating as a phenomenon. So in the next part of this, we'll talk about US Maple. All of this was to try and get us to a place where we can start to try and understand what the fuck is this band actually doing? What is this meant to be? What is the point they're trying to make? And US Maple for me are an apotheosis, like something of like a singular manifestation of a lot of these ideas. There's really very few people sound like them. And how did they get there? Well, hopefully we've helped illustrate that. Can I throw one final detail in here that just jumped out to me when I was doing the research? Madonna was in an art punk band with two of the original members of Swans in the early days. I had no idea this. It was Thurston Moore was like raving about her, like saying she was so legit, she was so in with that scene, like she was really genuine about being part of this art punk band before she got massive, which is why Sonic Youth went and did a cover of Madonna and used to walk about in Madonna t-shirts. Okay.
Can I just mention a couple of things? We were talking about Germany and Einstürzende and Neubauten. I think no discourse about post-rock or anti-rock, call it as you want, can ignore bands like Can, Faust, Neu, and all the krautrock, so-called krautrock bands that developed in Germany at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, and that really pushed the envelope very far when it comes to the boundaries of regular rock discourse, And I think a band like, if you listen to songs like Hallo Gallo, you cannot help but you hear Juno 44, you hear Slint, you hear, all these bands, And even more, you hear Trans Am, whatever was going to come from the US in the 90s, let's say, and early 2000s. So, I think that's a huge contribution to the entire German scene. Has given a huge contribution to the development of anti-rock styles and so on and so forth. So, and another thing I want to mention, another scene that always gets overlooked is the Ladbrokes scene in London in the late 60s. Bands like the Social Deviants, for instance, which were kind of freaking out, doing things quite similar to what Red Crayola were doing in the US. So I think that's another scene that people like Mick Farren, all these crazy visionaries, which came out of the ultra hippie, the most radical fringes of the British hippie scene. I think those cats should mention. I said cats.
Proper 60s terminology there.
They deserve a mention.
Ferro, you've put something in my head there that I think we'll start the next part off with. So I'm going to leave that hanging. I'm going to ask you guys a question at the start of side B, and you can freestyle your answer based on some of Ferro's comments there.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. So we reconvene for that.
Yes. Let's do it.
Absolutely. Bring it on.
Have you ever enjoyed this episode? Please.
Are you asking to me?
No.
Are you talking to me?
Have you enjoyed
or
this?
Or are you talking to the audience?
I'm talking to the audience. Have you enjoyed this episode?
I'm talking to the audience.
Yeah.
Of course they enjoyed it. Come on.
You've got a delay.
They're loving it.
Got a long way to go here.
They want more.
They've all get more. There's no denying that. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share and subscribe on the YouTube channel. That'd be great. And we'll see you next time for US Maple. See you soon. Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.